Hey guys, I've got another throwback video here with footage from back in September 2017. My good friend, fellow film shooter, and pilot Jamie managed to rent us a plane, and he'd planned a road trip of sorts through the American Southwest. We had a somewhat loose plan upon departure, but we were keen on hitting up a few cool locations from national parks like the Grand Canyon down to Las Vegas. Using a combination of the plane and rental cars, we had about 10 days to explore and shoot film. We mostly stayed at campsites along the way, but also grabbed a motel once or twice and got hotel rooms in Vegas. Now, as with most travel, I brought the Hasselblad 500 CM, which is my go-to travel camera. I've talked about it a lot before. My favorite feature is the interchangeable backs that you can use with this guy. I mean, I've got a few on my desk right here. And just being able to swap between black and white, slide film, color negative film, when you're out and about is invaluable. You'll see, I mean, sometimes a scene's better with one type of film than another, but there were a few cases where I shot the same scene with two completely different films, because I wasn't sure which one was going to look better. Now, medium format really hits the sweet spot for me. It's still portable enough to carry around and get those candid shots, but it's much higher quality than a 35mm film camera. Now, large format on the other hand, just a sec. It's higher quality, but honestly, it's probably 4 times the quality, but it's at least 20 times the work. You're dealing with loading magazines in a dark room. Just even the sheets of film is a pain. You definitely have to use a tripod. You're not really getting candid shots. There's a lot more setup time. Composing and recomposing is way harder with this guy. With this one, I'm using a dark cloth on the back to make sure I've got no glare. Usually not really worth it. Now that said, this was one of the few times I did take the 4x5 traveling. Usually when I go travel, I'm worried about, especially here, let me see, what's up? Alright, here's some large format dark slides. This is kind of one of the reasons I also don't like the idea of traveling with large format. Your film's going to be in these guys, and if you're flying somewhere on a commercial flight, you're probably going to want to get your film hand checked, and all it would take is for some security agent to lift the dark slide to destroy all your hard work. So I've always been kind of paranoid about taking these traveling, but in this case, in a private plane, no security checks, so I knew I could bring my film back without it getting destroyed. Alright, let's look at some of the images I made on the trip. I shot mostly slide film, but also some color negative and some black and white negative film as well. On the way down, I shot the first few frames with Velvia 50, and I've got a cool shot here of Jamie doing the logbook or some paperwork after one of our first flights transiting down to the southwest. These shots here refueling at a small airport are not only visually quite nice, but also kind of capture the feeling of adventure of taking a small plane on the road. Our first major destination was Canyonlands Field, just outside of Moab, Utah. While unpacking our plane, we ended up chatting with one of the guys working at the airfield, and he must have noticed our camping gear, but he let us know about a really cool campsite that him and his brother were going to be going to later that evening after he got off work. He described the site as like a remote slot canyon. It sounded super cool, and he invited us to come out there with him. Now, after brief internal consideration of being murdered by this friendly stranger out in the remote Utah wilderness, we decided to meet up with him after he got off work in Moab, and we headed out to this remote campsite. We set up camp, and then later that evening, or maybe the next night, I shot some night shots. And I didn't realize it at the time, but when the sun rose the next morning, it was honestly one of the coolest locations of our entire trip. There was this neat spire that overlooked our campsite, and our new friends had climbed up it. I grabbed a few shots of them, but I also went up there and took a few shots myself, overlooking our campsite and really showcasing the look of the canyon. Near Moab is a cool geological landmark called Gemini Bridges. It's these natural bridges that you can walk across. It kind of looks like a hole when seen across the valley. I shot a variety of medium format film here, but also broke out the 4x5 camera for the first time on the trip, and I believe I just shot a few black and white frames. One of the roll films I shot was Kodak's E100 VS, which was expired but must have been stored in kind of poor conditions, because upon development the whole roll was definitely not looking its best. It was almost like a light leak covered the whole roll. The slides were like super bright with a color cast. I'll show you examples of what they look like in the scans, and I did my best to correct in Lightroom, but not too happy with them. To be honest, not too stoked on any of the images I took in this location. I think this is a case where, you know, it's a really cool landmark, but sometimes things that visually look kind of cool when you're there don't translate as well to a photograph as you hope they would. Anyways, after that we continued driving, checking out scenic overlooks and national and state parks, just generally exploring and shooting film. I think initially we hit up Canyonlands National Park and Dead Horse State Park, and then later in the trip we went to like Bryce Canyon National Park and Zion National Park. Naturally, we also hit up Grand Canyon National Park from the North Rim, which was my first time ever going there. Two of the films I shot early on were Berger's Panchro 400, black and white film, and Kodak Ektar 100. The Panchro 400 is pretty low contrast and ended up pretty grainy. I'm not sure if that was my development or just the way the film had been stored. But the shots aren't too bad, nothing to write home about. The Ektar, on the other hand, I really like the colors. They pop. It's a pretty saturated color negative film, and really happy with the results. Jamie can be seen in a few of these clips shooting my Mamiya C330, which is a pretty awesome TLR. A lot of the scenic views on this trip overlook the Colorado River, and as I understand it, the river was responsible for carving a lot of these canyons and geological features we saw. Later we headed down to Monument Valley, a location famous for its huge buttes and beautiful scenes that are both recognizable in photography and cinema. Here's an iconic shot from Monument Valley, a pretty standard viewpoint, but nonetheless pretty impressive to see on large 4x5 slide. I think I helped set up the camera and Jamie actually shot this one. Somewhere around here, I also started shooting a roll of Rolly CR200, which is a slide film, but it's my favorite slide film to cross-process, which, if you're not familiar, it's a method of processing a film in the wrong chemicals in order to get unique results. In this case, slide film processed as color negatives gives you color negatives, but it's higher contrast and it's got interesting color. Have a look. The cross-process result definitely isn't as natural, but it can add a unique aesthetic, and honestly, sometimes I really dig it. Just south of Monument Valley, we pulled over to shoot this big peak. I later looked it up. It's called Agathala Peak, but it was this big ominous peak on the horizon as we drove south and the sun was setting. The next locations we went to were in the vicinity of Page, Arizona. They included the Glen Canyon Dam and also Horseshoe Bend, which is a really common photographer's hotspot. At the dam, I got some really cool shots on both slide film, I think it was Provia, and black and white film too. Here's Jamie getting close to the edge, as close as he was comfortable with, despite my encouragement. Horseshoe Bend was an amazing view, but surprisingly challenging to shoot without a wide angle lens. It was a lot wider of a scene than I thought based on photographs I'd seen online. With the Hasselblad, all I had was my normal focal length 80mm lens, and I ended up shooting 2 frames kind of side by side with the intention of maybe stitching them together if things worked out. And to be honest, here they are side by side, and it worked out pretty well. There's a barely visible seam down the middle, but I was quite happy with it. At this location, I also broke out the 4x5 large format camera, and I actually had a slightly wider lens for large format, so I shot two sheets of film here, one in portrait orientation and one in landscape orientation. Both images captured really nice detail, but I think the composition still leaves something to be desired. It's not particularly amazing. Sometime later on our journey, we arrived late to the north rim of the Grand Canyon, I think around sunset, and captured some images. After a night or two camping in the area, we headed back to the Grand Canyon to try to capture a sunrise. The light we got at sunrise wasn't particularly of high quality, and I didn't do it any favors by shooting the cross-process slide film there. Continuing on, Bryce Canyon was also on our hit list, and even on the way out there we pulled over several times because I remember really liking the contrast between the road and the colors of the surrounding environment. Bryce Canyon is also quite beautiful as it's full of these, really unique hoodoos and these beautiful geological colors. Now, Zion National Park was next, but I don't actually have any footage of Zion National Park because we arrived quite late in the afternoon, and my priority at the time was 100% just trying to get to the top of Angel's Landing to take a picture before the sun went behind the edge of the valley. I'd seen pictures from the view up there, and it was absolutely a race against the clock as soon as we arrived at the national park. It was a physically exhausting hike, especially at double time with a medium format camera and a large format camera in my bag, but upon summiting it, it was probably the sweetest viewpoint of the entire trip. And to be honest, that last stretch going up the summit is a pretty exciting climb. It's got like drop-offs on both sides and you're holding on to a chain. Anyways, after Zion, we backtracked to Canyonlands Field to grab the plane, and we flew it to Vegas for a few nights that would be a bit more relaxed than all the driving and camping. Somewhere on the way out of Zion, we pulled over, and Jamie and I both shot our own long exposure of the valley with this winding road below and the occasional car on it. I was really stoked on the concept, but the execution didn't pan out totally ideal. At some point, we also hit up Goblin Valley just after sunset. It's a bizarre location with these weird sandstone mushroom-shaped hoodoos. While we were there, we met another photographer who was actually doing some light painting, and I shot a couple frames both with and without him. The flight down to Vegas was great, and we had some beautiful scenery along the way, but I don't think I tried to shoot the Hasselblad as it still had the waist level viewfinder on it from the night before. Shooting through an elevated window while seated with a waist level viewfinder really wasn't going to work. During the day in Vegas, I shot a few frames with slide film, and at night I was shooting color negative film, I believe Portra 800. After Vegas, we started heading back to Canada with the plane, stopping in Jackson Hole for a night and camping out in Grand Teton National Park.
Not at all working.
The last frames I shot on our way back to Canada were of the Grand Teton Range and Grand Prismatic Spring in Yellowstone National Park, both awesome locations we had a chance to fly past. Alright guys, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video and photographs from our little journey. If you have any questions about the film or the trip itself, leave them in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See ya.